Pet Sematary is the second film adaptation of the Stephen King novel of the same name. The first one came out in 1989, which was 30 years ago, and nowadays it seems like it's the common trend to remake a lot of films, whether or not that might be old Disney films, westerns, and horror films, of course. And so here we go. We have another version of this same story from Stephen King. And in this story, we follow a family who has recently moved to a backwoods town in Maine, and after they settle into the new home, they realize that on their property, there is a parcel of land called the Pet Sematary. As you might guess, it has been dubbed this way by the people in this town because it's a place where pets of local children and families are buried here to honor them and to pay respects. But soon after the story begins, the patriarch of this family that moved in there, he discovers there's a lot more sinister things going on with the Pet Sematary and surrounding areas, sending this family into a whirlwind of tragedy and horrific occurrences that presents us with the movie that we have now. Look, if I'm being totally honest with you, I didn't really expect all that much from this movie. Despite all the hype that I heard out of South by Southwest, which was saying this is one of the best Stephen King adaptations in years, I wanted to give it a fair shot. Despite my own lack of anticipation for it, I wanted to see if it lived up to some of the hype that was given to it by some critics. To be quite honest with you, after having seen it myself, it doesn't really add up to anything all that memorable or scary. And if I'm being quite real with you, I honestly don't have all that much to say about it, so I'll just get straight into the storyline here. Even though it is based off Stephen King's material, I feel that Pet Sematary is one of those films that suffers not because of an idea, but because of how they execute that idea. The concept of having dead pets come to life and terrorizing a family is something that is definitely interesting, and there are certainly a lot of themes you could bounce off of that. While there is some good thematic drama that comes out of the original novel from what I've heard, none of that can be found here. The way that the writers and the director structured the story from the beginning to end kind of follows a by the numbers and played out horror structure. And because of that, when certain story beats would come into the story, I expected them to happen, but the way that they were executed and they were stylized, it just felt very cheap to me. There was no suspense or real any tension whatsoever, and it's never even really scary either. I don't think a horror film always has to be quote unquote scary to be effective. Get Out is a good example of that. I don't find that to be in any way frightening in a visceral sense, but it's horrifying because of what the implications are in its story. Pet Sematary, it fails on a visual standpoint of being truly scary, but as a story too. None of the characters have felt developed enough to really feel as if you can sense what the characters are feeling and also what emotional stakes are at play because of their actions. And I feel that's essential to a horror film. You need those characters to be in a place where you can fear for them. And so you're also scared because you feel the uneasiness through them as they experience all the things that you see in the story. And with Pet Sematary, that simply was not the case for me. There was a lot of interesting setup, sure, but once it gets to a certain point in the second act when things become a lot more played out, and at that point, a lot of my interest waned and the pacing went off the rails. And so, I don't know, it kind of lost me towards the end. But that's not to say I didn't have any enjoyment with this movie. There's certainly some fun to be had in witnessing some of these performances. Jason Clarke is an actor who I feel is underrated by Hollywood themselves, not necessarily audiences or some of his coworkers. I find him to be an actor that simply needs to be understood by a good director in order to make do on his potential, because he's definitely typecasted as someone who is often very quiet, I guess you could say, while also not really having that strong of a personality. Someone like Kathryn Bigelow was able to use that to their advantage very well in Zero Dark 30, with a performance in that movie that sent shivers down my spine because of the things that he was able to accomplish on camera. He delivers yet another performance where he doesn't exactly emote a lot, which kind of makes sense with what his character is dealing with. But at the same time, there's no real way to get into his character, understand what he's feeling. Since he is the main character of this narrative, it doesn't really work towards any effective way. In general, I also really like Amy Seimetz, who plays Jason Clarke's character's wife in this movie. But I feel as if, even though she was going for this Shelley Duvall type of character, the director didn't really know how to make that work instead of just having her emote a lot. And that's pretty much the emotional range of her character. The best performance in the film by far comes from John Lithgow. He is great in this movie. I never doubted that he would be one of the most entertaining parts. If anyone was going to go into this movie expecting him to be good, they'll be satisfied, because he definitely gives the most emotional depth to any character. And you can definitely see the most guilt in him. Otherwise, Pet Sematary is not offensively bad or anything. I think there's just a lot more they could have done with the storytelling and the characters, and especially with the aesthetics too. I was so disappointed that for a film which was praised for its horror and how intense and scary it was, it often played into so many of the cheap camera tricks and editing patterns that I find to be troubling in horror films. There's just so much claustrophobic imagery and awkward cuts. You don't really get enough of a viewpoint of the scary things to be frightened at. And also there's just some really awkward editing and scene transitions too, where they'll do these really cheesy cross dissolves. Even though the film is very good at establishing a mood and atmosphere that is intensely creepy, a lot of times when they're establishing these scenes, there's dark lighting, too much so, especially in scenes that are involved in a swamp. It was so obvious to me watching these scenes that they were constructed either in a studio warehouse or against a blue screen. It was very transparent, and I kind of wish they put more money into making those sets feel more authentic. Because watching these scenes, they kind of feel corny with how cheaply made they looked. In any case, I was pretty disappointed by Pet Sematary. If anyone does want to check out a horror film just because they love the genre, please go ahead and watch it and let me know what you think. For the most part, I find this to be a very underwhelming Stephen King adaptation, and I'm going to be giving it a C-. For an age recommendation, there's one scene that almost turned into a sex scene between a married couple, but they never take anything too far or inappropriate. Also, there's a considerable amount of language, but not really all that much until the second half. Most of what parents will probably be concerned about is violence, which is understandable because there is a good amount in this movie, but it's not incredibly excessive. You know, I would say that anyone who's squeamish may not want to watch this, but it's not so gory or intense to where people really be traumatized by what they see. Pet Sematary is probably best for people who are ages 15 and up. Thanks again for watching this review. Yes, I do still have a Shazam review coming out pretty soon, and I also want to try to react to some of the things that have been coming out for Star Wars Celebration in Chicago. To me, as a Star Wars fan, they mean so much, and I really want to share my thoughts to all of you on that, so look forward to that video as well. Please check out my Facebook page, my Letterboxd page, and Instagram profiles as well, which are in the links in the description below. And thanks again for watching, guys. Have a good one.